Jay Shear.
Jay Shear.
Jay Shear.
Jay Shear,
business consultant.
Jay Shear.
Jay Shear Business Consulting.
Welcome. I'm Jay Shear with Jay Shear Business Consulting. We build solid foundations for service-based businesses to grow and scale and achieve the results and success they deserve. And you've joined Business Minds Coffee Chat. Buddha is attributed to the quote, "We are what we think." Well, by some estimates, we spend most of our waking hours in our heads. Our inner voice powerfully influences more than what we might think. Can we change the way we think to change the way we feel? Well, on this episode, we're going to explore that voice in our head, why it matters, and how we can transform our thoughts to live a healthier, more satisfying, and productive life. Our guest is a husband and father, an experimental psychologist and neuroscientist, a world-leading expert on controlling the conscious mind, an award-winning professor in the University of Michigan's Psychology Department and its Ross School of Business. And in addition, he founded and directs the Emotion and Self-Control Laboratory at the university. Please welcome the author of the recently released book, Chatter, The Voice in Our Head, Why It Matters, and How to Harness It, Dr. Ethan Kross. Ethan, thank you so much for being here. It's great to see you.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I've got to share with you that this is such a fascinating topic to me, and I've thoroughly enjoyed researching you, learning more about you, consuming your content, and of course, reading Chatter. So I'm so excited about this conversation. So let's dig right in. So I'd love it if you would share with us when you first knew that you were going to have a career in academia.
Well, that light bulb went off, I would say, when I was probably in my junior year in college, maybe. Basically, I had grown up thinking that the ability to introspect is a really useful tool, right? When you experience problems, use your mind to solve them, focus inward, come up with solutions. And when I got to college, shortly after I figured out becoming a MD was not the path for me, I started taking other kinds of classes, one of which was a psychology class. And then I discovered that, well, a lot of people actually, when they try to use their mind to solve their problems, they end up getting stuck. They ruminate, they worry, they catastrophize, they experience what I call chatter, getting stuck in negative thought loops. And that to me was just fascinating. Why can some people really benefit from using their mind to solve their problems, whereas other people crumble when they do the exact same thing? And so that lit a fire in me to want to learn more about, what makes that work, and how can we help people use their mind more effectively, to introspect more effectively, to lead better lives. And so that certainly motivated me to go to graduate school. Mm-hmm. And then academia followed right after.
Well, you mentioned in the book about your father's influence on your ability to go inside, to go within. And it sounds like you were certainly very introspective as a child and throughout your life to this point. So share with us, if you will, some of the pros and cons of introspection.
I think the ability to introspect is a superpower that human beings have. It distinguishes us from other species. It lets us do things like learn from our past experiences, plan for the future, fantasize about the future, savor the past. It lets us, weave the story of our lives, right? Like we're human beings are meaning makers. We're constantly trying to make sense of our experiences and really figure out who we are based on our experiences in life. And introspection helps us do that. It also helps us control ourselves. So, in the book, I talk about introspection, and the inner voice, of course, is involved in that as a type of Swiss Army knife of the mind. It helps us do a lot of really important things. So it's a crucial tool.
So, speaking about the way that we interpret events and giving meaning to things, and this has been kind of a subject that's always fascinated me when it comes to meaning itself. So, things that we experience, they're they are actually neutral. It's the meaning that we attach to them that actually gives life to what that thing is. Is that a fair way of stating it?
Well, I think that we're interpreting virtually everything that's happening to us, right? And our interpretations certainly shape our emotional responses. Now, the only reason I hesitate a little bit is there are, of course, experiences we have that automatically give rise to certain kinds of emotional responses. For example, someone punches me in the face. There's an automatic, pain receptors are firing in our brain, like we're feeling pain. That's a negative state. There's not a whole lot of interpretation in the initial experience of that punch in the face. Other things, though, more complicated phenomena, like, let's say, being rejected at work. Well, many of us will probably interpret that negatively at first. Some, which would cause us to feel bad. Some might interpret a rejection as a blessing in disguise. Oh my God, thank God I didn't get that. I didn't really want it. I'm relieved. So I think that's an example of where your interpretation has room to color how you feel.
I
And that's certainly the case for many of the experiences we have. But there are those punches in the face and pinches and things of that sort that have instant reactions that I think bypass interpretation.
Well, that makes perfect sense. And the stories that we tell ourselves and the way that we color the meaning that we give to something, it seems that oftentimes that's affected by our upbringing, by biases, by the people we surround ourselves with, conversations we're having, information we're consuming. Is that would that be a fair statement to make?
Absolutely. We are our inner voice and how we make meaning is tuned by our surroundings, like beginning at a very young age, where the messages of our parents and our caretakers and our friends and teachers, right? Those that culture. I mean, that is our culture, right? Is shaping how we interpret the world. It's giving us a lens to make sense of our experiences, and that lens can change as we evolve and go throughout our lives, right? Like, I grew up in a middle class neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York, and there are many ways of making sense of the world there that I don't meaning make in the same way right now living in Ann Arbor, right? I mean, you know, back then someone cut me off when I'm driving on the road and there was an immediate honk on the horn. There might have even been a few select fingers raised. Like, that would never happen anymore, right? Because culture has shaped and changed the way I make sense of my experiences. So,
Yeah.
yeah. And that makes sense too, right? Like, you would expect us to be flexible to the social environment around us. And I think this discussion reflects that sensitivity that we all have. Like, we're trying to fit in wherever we are.
Yeah, we would hope that would be the case for sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
So I want to dive into chatter. But before I do, or before we do, could you share with us when the idea for the book really first began to percolate? And you talk about your father and that the experiences that you had kind of planted the seed. But where did this first start to take shape? And then also, I would love to hear what the process was like for you bringing this book to life.
sure. Well, I think uh, I've always been passionate about not only doing science, but translating it, talking to others about it. So it's not just scientists talking to scientists. That's fun and useful, but there's a whole world out there that I think is interested in understanding the mind. both purely because we all have one, right? But also because, I do think that if you understand how the mind works, it gives you more power to potentially harness it for your own benefit. So that had always been a goal. And then I was actually teaching a class here about 6 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, a seminar on the science of self-control to undergrads. And you could think about this class as science's greatest hits when it comes to understanding how to manage our emotions and our thoughts. And it was always a lot of fun to teach. And the final assignment every time I taught the class was for students to come to class with questions for me. I had spent the rest of the semester asking them questions, so we basically reverse roles. And the last time I taught this course, this one student asked me, "Why are we learning about this now?" And I really didn't understand what she was getting at. And what she went on to explain was, well, if these findings are so relevant and important, why didn't anyone teach us about them earlier? Like we have a need to control ourselves and our thoughts and our behaviors throughout our lives. Why didn't anyone tell us about this in elementary school or middle school? And that question really stuck with me because I didn't have a good answer. And so it led me to actually do some research on that topic, where I started partnering with other academics and high school teachers to create a curriculum that takes this, what we know about the science of self-control, and puts it into a set of fun lesson plans for high school students to learn about the mind. So that was one effort to try to translate the science. But the other effort was this book Chatter, which is, what we're talking about today. And there the idea was, let's take what we know, what I'd spent the past 20 years studying about how to manage these negative thought loops, which I think are really quite prevalent among, people. I call this is an age-old problem. It's like a biblical problem. Adam and Eve worrying about the apple and the snake, right? We've been dealing with these kinds of worry for a really long time. The book was my attempt to share that science with folks writ large, and so that's when the idea was born.
Hmm. Remarkable. So, since you brought up about offering some training, some solutions, and opening the discussion at a high school level, because our brains aren't fully formed until what, our 20s, thereabouts?
Well, and there's actually still changes that are happening after, but
Mm.
yeah, there's rapid development happening in adolescence.
So, with that said, and knowing that you are helping to build some high school curriculum, could this type of training be beneficial at an even earlier age, or not, because we don't have enough life experiences, or we're not developed enough yet?
No, I think it can absolutely be useful earlier. And the reason we started in high school was in part it was it was a convenience sample, what we call. We had access to high school students to work with, but I think if pitched at the right level, we could certainly teach kids about how the mind works in ways that would be useful to them. Look, Sesame Street does this, right? Like they've had psychologists consult teaching kids about how they can delay gratification and manage big emotions. The Mr. Rogers Show, which has recently been reincarnated in the form of Daniel Tiger, also teaches lessons about self-management. I think as long as it's pitched at the right level, I think this could be really useful. And one way to think about it is like this. We make decisions in education about what we think is important knowledge for people to have. And we've made several decisions historically about what that is. And, we think, for example, it's important for kids to know about social studies and biology, like the digestive system. I always come back to the digestive system as an example because I remember really enjoying learning about it when I was a kid. Um, but if you asked me, like, how often do I use my knowledge of peristalsis in daily life? Maybe once every 4 or 5 years when my kids ask me how they can eat food upside down, why it doesn't come out. Like that's it, right? So, but we teach it to everyone. But the mind is as much a part of the body and who we are as our digestive system. Yet let's think about the importance of the mind to our lives and understanding the mind and how it works. It's the quarterback. it controls our emotions, our thoughts, our behaviors, the ones we want to have, the ones we don't want to have. So to me, purely from a pedagogical perspective, I don't understand why we're not teaching about the mind at a young age. I think it's as important as teaching about math and other forms of science. Um, and so that's my take on it.
No, I'm right there with you. I look back over the course of my life up to this point, and really, I didn't begin to understand or at least start to study more about my mind, about consciousness, about self talk, and those sorts of things really until my mid to upper 20s. And then I got very, very interested in it. But all those years, all those years of, in many cases, suffering because of the chatter, which we'll talk about. And had I had the tool sets, had I been exposed at an earlier age and been around others that were familiar and could have maybe guided me along, I can't even imagine where I'd be today, but that's a story for another time. So,
But let me just add something because I think there's an important point here, which is, in the book chatter, I talk about what is the inner voice, the science behind it, and then a lot of different tools, science-based tools that we've discovered that can help people manage the inner voice when it becomes chatter, the bad stuff. But you know what was interesting studying, like researching the book and studying this topic, is a lot of people stumble on tools, like stumble on some of the tools that I talk about in the book. Like they use these tools to manage their chatter without even knowing it. These are people who have had no knowledge of, no formal training in psychology and so forth. And so when you say you didn't have any background in psychology up until your late 20s, I suspect you were probably using some of the tools that I talk about, maybe, but unknowingly. And I think the value of the science is it gives us the ability to shine a spotlight on the things that work, so that you can make people be a lot more deliberate about how they bring these tools into their lives. And so that's one of the hopes for the book.
yeah, yeah, I love that. That's fantastic. So let's go ahead and dive in. I wanted to draw attention to one thing in particular, and this is really at the very beginning. And I love this. I've been a Dan Harris fan for for many
Uh-huh.
many years, but I love the quote that you put at the beginning of the book from him. The voice in my head is an asshole, and that's so Dan Harris. It just sounds like him. And the reason that resonated with me is because it reminded me of the times when I'm meditating, and I know that Dan is an advocate of meditation these days. And this is one of those times where when I'm sitting there and I'm practicing a meditation practice and those voices, right? Which I can't quiet them, but I try to focus on how I can just receive them and then let them go and not grasp on to anything in particular. So that's what that quote
Yeah.
resonated with me. So anyway, good stuff.
Yeah. No, I remember I was in an airport, I think in Arizona. What doesn't matter. I was in an airport somewhere warmer than Michigan, and I remember seeing Dan's book on the bookshelf, and it just really resonated. This idea that I think so many of us have about, look, oftentimes like this part of who we are, this our inner monologue is not a very fun, nice inner monologue. It's an asshole, to use his quote. And but the flip side to that is the other quote that I start the book with, by Barack Obama, who talks about his inner voice as his crutch, his secret superpower that he relies on to make the most important decisions. And I think the juxtaposition of those two quotes, it captures the book, right? Because it's not about quieting the inner voice and having the inner voice go away. It's about harnessing it. It's about making it work for you. And I think that's something that we all struggle with at times.
Yeah, so good. What an interesting dichotomy.
Yeah.
So, great way to start the book. So, The book is really comprised of 7 chapters, and it's filled with just riveting stories and some great research, and it's real world case studies and also the powerful tools, obviously. And what I love about this is you're able to take the science and back it up and present it in a way that is practical, that is digestible for anyone, and that it really does make an impact, right? So it's something that we can learn from, but most importantly, we can use it. So let's first start, and you've already alluded to this, but I want to make sure that we are being very distinctive here in how we explain it. Share with us how you define chatter, and then I'd also like you to address, why do we talk to ourselves?
Right. So, so I'm going to do it in reverse order.
Okay.
So we talk to ourselves because silent inner speech helps us do many different things. You could think of it as a tool of the mind. And so some of the things that silent inner speech helps us do, things as simple as just keeping a nugget of information active in our heads. Inner speech is a part of the human working memory system, which is a system for working with information that we all have. So if I were to ask you, okay, my phone number is 209-0501, just memorize that, repeat it in your head silently. You just talk to yourself, right?
Yes.
That's one manifestation of the inner voice. And we use that all the time. Verbal working memory. It without it, you can't really live life. We do have to keep nuggets of information active. But our inner voice also helps us do lots of other things. It helps us control ourselves, like when we give ourselves instructions. All right, put this screw here and then this part here, like if you're working on a difficult task, or if you're trying to coach yourself through a problem, you're in the shower, you're struggling with something. Okay, well, all right, here's what I should do. Like that's an inner monologue that you're engaging that's trying to help you work through a problem. We use our inner voice. We talk to ourselves when we're trying to plan things, like before I have to give a big presentation, I'll often repeat in my head. I'll rehearse what I'm going to say, like in my head, silently.
Mm-hmm.
I'll talk to myself. I'll then actually hear what the obnoxious person in the audience, what question they're going to ask me, and then I'll respond to them. Now, truth be told, the way I respond in my head, not how I'd respond in daily life. It more closely resembles, a Robert De Niro monologue from one of his mafia movies. But so we're simulating, we're planning. That's what it does. I mean, so these are 4 functions. There are other things it helps us do, but that's all about talking to ourselves. When does chatter strike? Chatter strikes when we try to use this tool that works for us so well in so many situations to work through negative problems, like intense negative feelings. And what often happens there is, okay, we try to work through the problem, come up with a solution, but then it's like the system gets jammed up, because rather than coming up with a coherent plan of attack and way of progressing, we get stuck. We get stuck harping on the negative features of the experience. We think about what happened to us, what we felt, what could happen. Oh my God. And then we just keep looping. And then we're not happy with the looping. So what do? We try to work through it even more, which just makes us loop even further. That's what chatter is. You could do it about things that happened in the past, ruminating about the past, worrying about the future. It's all involves these negative thought loops. So that's the predicament.
So speaking of that loop, and I think about today, and we talk so much about being present, living in the moment, like right now, you and I having
Yeah.
this conversation, right? Staying focused on what you're saying and not thinking about what I want to say next, or allowing my thoughts to go in 18 different directions. I want to be right here, right
Just
now.
18 for you?
Yeah,
That's pretty good.
isn't that good? But with that said, you talk about our default state in the book. Explain what our default state is, if you don't mind.
So if you ask if you have most people, you just ask them to sit quietly, just close your eyes and think about whatever you want. Most people don't just focus on the present, like how they're feeling in that moment. Their minds drift away. They think about the past, they think about the future. And what scientists refer to that as our default state. If nothing is consuming our attention, right? If we're not focusing carefully on, like, hitting a baseball as one example, our default state is just to float away, to not be in the present. And I think that the recognition that that's how people are built. Well, actually, before I get into that, let me say this is a really useful capacity, the ability to travel in time in our minds, right? Because that's what lets us do things like learn from mistakes, plan for the future, savor victories from the past, fantasize about, the end of COVID, sitting on a beach with a pina colada in the future. This gives me much joy, right? So it's our ability to drift away that allows us to do all those wonderful things. Now, I think a current zeitgeist in popular culture is to always be in the moment, right? Really be present focused. I have nothing against being present focused and mindful. Mindfulness, and I've been meditating on and off since I was 5 years old. I recognize the value. There's great research behind it, but it's one tool. It is not the only tool that exists for managing stress. And I think part of the problem is if you think that your goal is to always be in the moment, good luck, because not going to happen.
Hmm.
That's not how we're built. So I think one thing that I'd like people to consider is, rather than working against the way we're constructed, how can we work within the architecture of the mind to make it work better? So rather than
Yes.
saying, let's not go in the past or the future, how about we start thinking about, well, how do you go into the past and the future without getting stuck there? How do you benefit from that kind of mental time travel without having to require for us to shut that whole system down and just be in the moment? And that's what the book deals with, to a large degree.
Yeah. Outstanding. I love that. So you you go into a lot of detail in each of these chapters, and I'd like to maybe highlight a couple pieces of each of the chapters. And obviously, we're going to provide a link in the show notes so everyone can go buy the book, because that's the most important thing, because you're going to get a lot of good detail and context around everything we're talking about right now. But one thing that you shared, I believe it was toward the beginning of the book, which was just a remarkable story, is we all have that. Well, I shouldn't say we all, I don't want to generalize, but that inner voice, it seems like most of us have it. But you tell the story of a woman who lost that inner voice.
Yeah.
And what an interesting story. But so share a little bit about that, if you will, and the impact that that had when she lost that voice.
Yeah, so this is a story of a neuroanatomist who had a stroke, and the stroke temporarily impaired her language, some of her language centers in the brain, so she could no longer use language, both to talk to others, but also to talk to herself. And what's fascinating about her story is that initially she described the way she felt as euphoric, reflecting what I think is a common sentiment that I often hear from people is, oh, I just want to quiet those voices in my head. I just want them to go away, disappear. Which, by the way, is not something I would wish upon my worst enemy. And the reason why is the following. If you read further into her story, what she begins to say is, well, initially not having those voices was great, but then it started to become not so great because, yes, I was no longer worried about stuff, but I also stopped being able to narrate my experiences. I stopped being able to make sense of my experiences, and she realized that her ability to use language to make sense of her world was central to her understanding of who she was, to the construction of her identity. So, so she basically, by wiping out the inner voice, she wiped out the chatter, but also all the good stuff that the inner voice provided. And I think the important lesson that comes from that is that our goal shouldn't be to silence the voice in our head permanently. It should be to figure out how to harness it, how to not get stuck in chatter, instead make that inner voice work for us instead.
Yeah. Wow, truly an amazing story. So, chapter 2 in the book, you talk about what happens when talking to ourselves backfires. And another great story that you share is around the Cardinal pitcher, Rick, is it Ankiel?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I could put myself in that story as you were explaining it. And you did such a great job of giving color and context around it. And there were so many different scenarios that I can imagine in my own life where, I ran into maybe a similar type of situation, different, but still similar. So talk a little bit about that particular story and why it's such an important one and how the impact that had, because he used the term the monster to describe what he was experiencing in that voice in his mind.
Yeah. So this story is a really powerful one, and basically, this pitcher Rick Ankiel was just coming up. He was a rookie and was widely regarded as one of the next potential great pitchers of all time. Not just a good pitcher, like a really good one, but had the potential to be the best ever. And throughout his first league with the Cardinals, he was living up to those expectations. And then something funny happened. Tragic is a better word. During the playoffs when he was pitching, he threw a wild pitch, which isn't unusual for pitchers. For those of it, for anyone who watches baseball, like wild pitches happen to the best of them at times. But he threw one wild pitch, and then he threw another one, and then he threw another one, and then the monster started churning in his head, his chatter, and essentially it completely unraveled his ability to pitch, which he'd been doing for decades, and it destroyed his career as a pitcher. He actually he never came back to his form, and actually had to leave the league. There's a positive story in the end, but his pitching career was over. The way that works is as follows: when we experience chatter, we immerse ourselves in the problem. We get so fixated on the issue that we tunnel vision into it, which in the case of Ankiel, the problem for him was his windup. So what did he start doing? He started hyper focusing on every element of his windup. Now, a pitching windup is an amazingly intricate set of behaviors that are linked together over time. You're moving your weight back and forth, you're picking up your leg, you're pulling your arm back, you have a proper way of holding the ball. There's a lot of different pieces to it that we just do it. It's an automatic habit, right? And if you start thinking about the individual elements, all bets are off. It unravels. And what chatter did for him is it led him to hyper focus on all the different pieces of his windup, which basically led to it to unravel. And so one of the things we now know about chatter is it can powerfully undermine our performance at work, on the ball field, in two ways. The first way is the Ankiel way. When we're engaging in a complex behavior that works precisely because we don't have to think about it, like how do you give a good speech and monitor you're undulating your voice as I'm using my hands, as I'm gesticulating, all these things are presumably effective for communication. When you experience chatter, you start hyper focusing on all the different features of the act, and it leads to something called paralysis by analysis.
Hmm.
And that can be really bad when you're trying to perform under high stakes conditions. The other way that chatter can tank us at work and at school is by consuming our attention. So we all know that we have a limited ability to focus on things at any given moment in time. And as a proof of that, I would ask listeners and watchers to just think about a time when they maybe read a few pages in a book, when they were worried about something, only to get to the end of that passage and discover they didn't remember a thing that they actually read. Very
Yeah.
common experience, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so if chatter is consuming the neural hardware that we have to focus, there's nothing left over to do our work. And there's a lot of work showing how experiencing chatter in the form of anxiety and rumination can undermine performance at school, lead to impaired negotiations in business, and a host of other negative consequences. So that's one way that chatter can really sink us. and it constitutes one of the domains that it impairs. There are actually two others. I don't know if you want me to get into it, but it can
Yeah,
affect our
please.
health and our relationships too.
Yeah, let's dig into health first, and let's go to relationships, because I think this is a very important point because it's relatable, and I have no doubt that many of our listeners have experienced this before, and I think it's important that we hear each of the different areas where chatter can affect us, and then we're going to talk about how we move past and
Tools.
harness the tools that
Yeah.
harness the
Yeah.
power.
The good news is, before I give you the negatives, there are lots of tools that can help. So that's the silver lining. But so let's talk very briefly about health and relationships. So health, we often hear that stress kills. That actually isn't true. Stress in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's really helpful for, I think, all of us to have a system that quickly allows us to respond to threats in our environment. And that's what a stress reaction, a fight or flight response allows us to do. We're in the presence of a threat, we're confronted, we either approach or avoid. No harm there when it comes to our health. When stress becomes toxic is when a stress reaction goes up and then remains elevated chronically over time. And this is what chatter in part does, because what it allows us to do is essentially relive our stress experiences, right, over and over and over again. So something bad happens. I get into an argument with someone at work. I don't just have the argument, experience the stress, and then move on with my life and it's over and I'm back to normal. I think about the argument and I think about it again and again and again. And that in turn is leading to the elevation of this stress response in our bodies. And that's what leads to a wear and tear on our bodies that can contribute to things like cardiovascular disease, certain forms of cancer, sleep disorders, and so forth. And
Mm.
so there can be really pernicious negative physical health implications of chatter. With respect to our relationships, chatter can also interfere with those, because one of the things we know is that when people experience the kinds of strong negative emotions that characterize chatter, they're often driven to talk to other people about their experiences. They want help. So they seek out other people to talk to them. But one of the things that often happens is they find other people to talk to, and then they keep talking to them about them and keep talking and keep talking. And that can end up actually creating social friction in our relationships, pushing other people away. And so that's just, we're talking about work and performance, our relationships, and our health. I think these are three domains that really matter to all of us. And those are the stakes.
Those areas are huge, and just full transparency. I mean, I've experienced each of those in multiple ways, and I think about the like a toxic environment, a toxic work environment, ruminating on the whatever the issue is, tying back to an individual that maybe, we had a bad interaction, and just continuing to think about that. And it reminds me of the saying that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. And we continue to
Mm.
suffer when we just keep bringing that same issue up over and over again. So I feel you on that one. Incredible. So now let's then talk about some of the tools, because again, there's a lot involved with chatter. And now that we have a better understanding of what it is and the impact that it has, let's talk about how we can start to work through it and transform our thoughts and harness that power.
Yeah. So again, the good news is that there are lots of tools that exist to help us manage these internal conversations. I like to break it down as tools for falling into three buckets. So there are things you can do on your own. There are ways of harnessing our relationships, ways of talking to other people to get support, and then ways of interacting with our environments around us, physical environments, actually, ways of controlling our chatter from the outside in, if you will.
Okay.
So why don't I give you an example from each one? There are 20 something I talk about in the book, so we don't have enough time to go through all of them. But I'll
Mhm.
give you a couple of my favorites. Does that sound good?
That'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Okay. So in terms of things you could do on your own, one of the things we know about chatter is as I think I mentioned before, we tend to get immersed in our problems when we're experiencing chatter. We're hyper, very narrowly focused on the situation at hand, like we have tunnel vision. And that tunnel vision, or that sense of being immersed in the problem, it makes it difficult for us to consider the bigger picture, broader ways, other ways of thinking about the issue that might help us resolve it. And so one common theme behind many of the tools that people can use on their own to manage chatter is to try to get some distance from the problem, to quote unquote be able to step back, to think about the situation more objectively. And there are lots of ways you could do it. One thing you could do, if you're dealing with an acute problem, something that happened and isn't necessarily going to recur, you can do something called temporal distancing. So I actually do this a lot when it comes to dealing with the stresses of the pandemic. I travel in time in my head and I think, how am I going to feel about this problem, the pandemic that is, 9 months from now when everyone's vaccinated, or 12 months from now, and I'm back to doing the things I was doing before, seeing my colleagues, my kids are in school, I'm traveling. When I travel in time in my head that way, when I temporarily distance, what that does is it makes it clear that what I'm experiencing right now is temporary. And that gives me hope. And we know that hope is a powerful balm for managing chatter. I also go back in time sometimes. I think about the pandemic of 1918. And, God, that was even worse than what we're dealing with now. There was no Zoom, there was no Uber Eats. And guess what? They got through it. We're sitting here today. So, we survived. And so will we. And so that's one way of broadening our perspective, getting some distance.
Okay.
Another way you could get some distance is to try to coach yourself through a problem like you were giving advice to a friend. We know that people are much better at advising other people than they are taking their own advice. And what we've learned is that we we can essentially capitalize on that insight by talking to ourselves like we're talking to someone else. And the way you do it is to use your name. We call it distant self-talk. So, all right, Ethan, how are you going to handle this situation? Here's what you should do. Although it may sound silly, that is a distancing tool. What we're doing, like, if you think about what are the situations where we use names, we use names when we think about and refer to other people. So when you use your own name to think about your own problems, it's like a psychological jujitsu technique. It's shifting your perspective. It's getting you to relate to yourself like you were relating to another person. And we could be really great advisors to other people. And so that's another kind of distancing tool people can use.
Love that.
So and there are many others that I talk about in the book that fall into that first bucket. Let's shift to, what about our relationships? Well, we often think that talking about our problems is a good thing. And indeed it can be, but it can also be a bad thing, or at best a neutral thing. So what I mean by that is this: there's a strong belief in popular culture that when we're experiencing chatter and negative emotions, we should just vent, find someone to talk to and just unload. Here's what happened. Here's what I felt. Venting on its own can be really good for making people feel close and connected. If I know, Jay, that I can call you up and you're there to really listen to me and empathically connect and hear me out, there's
Hmm.
something really emotionally redeeming about that, about knowing that we can have that exchange. So if I'm venting to you, we feel really close and connected, and that feels good. But if all we do is vent, there's a problem, because it's akin to just throwing logs on a flame. You just keep it burning because I keep on just rehashing what I felt and what happened to me, rather than looking at that bigger picture, reframing how I'm thinking about the event. So what you ideally want to have happen in an exchange with another person is find someone you could talk to who you can share your emotions with a little bit. But at some point during the conversation, they nudge you to go broader. So, if we're talking, I learn about the terrible interview you had with your, a guest. Now, at some point after learning about what you felt and what went wrong, I might say, well, Jay, you probably had other bad interviews. How'd you deal with those? Right. So I'm trying to get you to broaden your perspective. Or maybe I'd say, you know what? I've had an exchange like that. Here's what I did. So, and those are just two examples. But the idea is that we're establishing that connection, but then we're getting into problem solving mode at the appropriate time.
Hmm.
And I think the take home lesson there is that people can be really deliberate about who they choose to talk to about their chatter. I'm really thoughtful about this. There are many people in my life that I know love me and I love them, that I don't tell them about my chatter because I know it's just going to make me feel worse. And so I'm very careful about who I seek out for support.
Wow.
So
Before you go further, I
yeah,
just want to throw in that right there is such an important point. I look around the individuals that I spend the most time with, and there are times where if I'm spending time with someone and it's always the negativity, it's always the chatter that's going on, and it just pulls energy away from me. And that's all I get in those kinds of conversations. I have to distance myself. I mean,
yeah,
I actually
ex-
have to make a conscious choice to not spend time with that individual because of that. But I think the tool that you just hit on is a great one. If I can, during the conversation, if I can make that switch, get greater perspective, I'll try that. But yeah, that's a powerful one.
yeah, and I think there's a lesson here not only for listeners who themselves are experiencing chatter to figure out how they can construct like their chatter board of advisors, so to speak, right? Like there's a lesson for them for doing that, for getting help. But I think there's also a lesson for how we ourselves can be better advisors to others, right? So I use this science to, when other people come to me for support, and advice, I'll hear them out, and at the appropriate time, I'll try to nudge them to go broader. So there's a lesson here for both obtaining support and providing it.
Love it.
Um, so, so that's one example of how relationships fold into this. There are lots of other relationships are tricky, and there are many other different ways they can help us that I talk about. But I won't tell you about any of those. Let me just go to environment because there's some tools there. So one of the most enjoyable and interesting parts of writing the book and researching it was discovering the idea that tools exist around us in our physical worlds for managing the conversations happening inside us. One tool has to do with order, creating order in our environment. So, one of the things we know is that when people experience chatter, they often feel like they don't have control of their minds. Their minds are disordered and controlling them, right? Their chatter. And what we've learned is that you can compensate for that experience by establishing order around you. So by
Hmm.
tidying up your spaces, you're creating lists. For me, it's cleaning the dishes, which I never otherwise do. And so that's one way you can leverage your environment to help you when you're spinning. And it's one of the reasons why many people like myself who are not particularly organized and orderly, when we experience chatter, will spontaneously do things like organize our space. And so it gives some explanation to that experience. Um,
Amazing.
one other environmental tool is experiencing awe. So seeking out awe-inspiring experiences. Awe is an emotion we feel when we're in the presence of something vast that we have trouble explaining. I felt it yesterday when I watched the Mars rover land, and that was awe-inspiring to me. I just the idea that we figured out how to take this machine, blast it off into outer space, and then have it land millions of miles away, start up and start it. I mean, I can't contemplate it. It fills me with awe. And what we know is that when you experience awe, it leads to what we call a shrinking of the self. We in our own problems feel smaller when we experience awe. Like, here I am ruminating about, the whether I should have said that thing in the email I sent earlier. Oh my God, did I offend someone? Like that's the problem on the one hand, and then I'm contemplating, creating a rover and landing it on another planet on the other. It has a way of putting our problems in perspective. And so we've got things you could do on your own, relationships, environment. Yes, chatter is a real problem, a significant problem, but tools exist all around us, inside us, in our relationships, in the world to manage it. And I think that the fact that we have evolved to have these tools in all those different places is really just fascinating.
Hmm.
And so I try to share that in the book.
And you have so much goodness coming out of this conversation and in this book. It's fantastic. So let me ask you this. What would you like, as you look over all of the work that you've done up to this point, and there's no question that there's so much more that's going to be coming out of you in the years ahead. What do you want your legacy to be?
Uh, you know, uh, I haven't really thought about that. Let me tell you. Here's a roundabout way of answering that question. Um, as a scientist, I have free reign to choose what I do research on, and there are usually two questions I ask myself before taking on a new project, which is, does if everything were to go right, and it often doesn't, but let's say it does, if everything went right with this project, would what we've learned really move the needle on our understanding of human nature and our understanding of how people can manage themselves? So that's one question I ask. And if I say yes, I do the project. The other question I ask is, does asking this question, does working on this project have the potential to somehow substantially help people in the world? And if the project can do both of those things, enlighten us about human nature and help people, great. But if it could do either one of those two, that's great too. I guess I hope my legacy is that I can achieve one of those two goals, or both. That is, contribute some scientific knowledge that helps us understand who we are, and also helps us navigate the world more effectively and live better lives. I think if I was able to do either of those two things, I'd be really happy.
Man, I love that. And for all of you that are listening right now, those two questions talk about thinking bigger, right? Asking yourself big questions, because that's what really helps us move the needle. When we can think bigger, we can do bigger things. So I love that. Great, great questions. So, what is something that you believed about yourself that you found out that just was not true?
Hmm. Um, that maybe that I was immune to chatter earlier on in my life. Growing up, I was always really, actually, very, very good at regulating my emotions. I didn't get into this area because I was bad at experiencing chatter and wanted to figure out a solution. To the contrary, I was really good at not getting stuck, and was curious about why it often went wrong. So, which is the reverse of a lot of people in this area. But I've since, with kids and all that, I've had my fair share of chatter, and so that was, I think, humanizing, humbling, and taught me something about myself.
Okay, very good. So, before I ask my last question to you, please share with us where we can go to connect with you, consume your amazing content, and also be able to purchase Chatter.
The good news is it's all in the same place. So www.ethankross.com, and that's Cross with a K, Kross. And you could find information about the book, me, links to my lab, and articles, and plenty.
Outstanding. And I am going to encourage all of you that are either watching or listening right now, do yourself a favor. Don't walk, run to go pick up a copy of this book. It's a life changer, and you will absolutely thank me for it. Not that that's what I'm looking for, but I promise you this is a worthwhile read. So go do it. So here's my final question to you. So, what is one of the most valuable lessons that you've learned through failure that has had a significant impact on how you show up today?
That you can't really achieve great things without failing, and in some ways, if you're not failing, you're not growing. So I think that has been something I've learned, that if things are too easy, then it means I'm not really trying hard enough. And then the flip side to that too is that, that's a positive spin on failure. Failure
Mhm.
still isn't fun. And really the power of temporal distance in it there to know that, yeah, I failed plenty, and guess what? I get over it. So reminding myself of that too, when failures do inevitably occur, is helpful for keeping me on track, for not giving up and retreating.
How did I know you were going to tie that back to the inner voice? Perfect response. Thank you. Love
It's
it.
fundamental.
Yes, it is. So, Ethan, thank you so very much for being here today and spending time with us on Business Minds Coffee Chat. I'm just so incredibly grateful for you for sharing your knowledge, sharing your experience and your wisdom with us, and bringing chatter to life and giving us the tools and the resources to transform and empower our own lives. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks. This was a ton of fun, and thanks for having me.
My pleasure. And for all of you, thank you so much for watching and listening. And do us a favor, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and also leave us a review. I know that Ethan and we would both love to find out, what did you think about this episode? And also maybe share one or two key takeaways that were most meaningful to you. And to enjoy more episodes and to learn how J. Shear Business Consulting can build a solid foundation for your service-based business, just visit jshearbusinessconsulting.com. And until next time, keep learning and growing, implement the powerful tools in chatter, and we'll see you on the next Business Minds Coffee Chat. Take care.
J Shear
J Shear
Business Consultant.
J. Shear Business Consulting.